It's a great pleasure to be here today for the Temple City Centennial Celebration and present a four-part series of talks about the history of the Temple family and about the area. So we're going to start by going into some of the background of the Workman and Temple family in greater Los Angeles. The Homestead Museum is a historic site in the City of Industry. I'm the director there and manage it for the City of Industry. Our interpretive period is 1830 to 1930, so we're looking at a broad expanse of time from the Mexican period through the roaring 1920s, and a lot of change, obviously, during that century, probably more than any American city outside maybe of Chicago. On the left is an image, a drawing of Los Angeles from the Mexican period, where you've got this small little village, probably 1,000 people or under. On the right, though, is the City Hall, which was built on a location we'll be talking about during this presentation, and it's reflective of a community of 1 million people, so a huge change just through the population side of it. As for the family, the first member to come to Los Angeles was Jonathan Temple, born at the end of the 18th century in the area of Boston, Massachusetts. When he was a young man, he took ship to a place called the Sandwich Islands, better known as Hawaii, and there he became a merchant, following the missionaries that had come from Massachusetts not long before and opened up what had been the most isolated part of the world. The Hawaiians were really outside of contact with almost anybody prior to that. He stayed for several years in Hawaii, lived in Honolulu, ran his store. He was arrested by the kingdom for reasons that are not entirely clear, but that probably spurred him to leave and come to Mexican Alta California, as it was known. And it was pretty early on for this. Mexico had only been independent for several years. They had just started encouraging Americans and Europeans to trade and settle in their area, which was not allowable during the Spanish period. And so a network of Pacific Rim trade, small as it was, had been developing. It involved China, the Philippines, South America, the western coast of Mexico, Hawaii, and of course, California. So Temple arrives in 1828 at a very opportune time as these changes are starting to happen. And he notices there are no stores in this pueblo. People have been used to either growing what they could locally or acquiring things directly from ships that were anchored off the shore at places like San Pedro or even Dana Point in what is now Orange County. So he acquires some very early property and develops it into what became known as the Temple Block. So he started off with a single-story adobe. It was his house as well as his store. And then he built this two-story structure just as the American period is beginning and the Mexican era has ended. It was an adobe building. That's probably Temple with his stovepipe hat and his frock coat made out of wool, perfect for a balmy climate here in Los Angeles. But it became the emerging center of the business community in Los Angeles over time. There were a few Americans and Europeans who were the early merchants, and they began to develop a significant amount of power, not just economically, but also in politics and in other ways. And with his burgeoning income, Temple is able to acquire a large rancho called Los Cerritos, which is the Long Beach, Lakewood, Bellflower area of the South Bay. Off to the right there on the map, to the left is the Rancho San Pedro, and not far at the bottom would be the very rudimentary harbor of San Pedro and Wilmington. So he is acquiring this property because he's close to where he can ship hides and tallow raised from the cattle on his ranch. That was the industry at that time, were the skins as well as the fat from the animals to be made into soap and candles. And he is engaged in that kind of a business in addition to his store. Back in Los Angeles, though, over time, he begins to turn more to development, especially as you start seeing the commercial component becoming a bigger thing. So not too far south of that two-story adobe building I just showed, he built one of the early brick commercial buildings in the community. It was part, again, of this Temple Block. You're looking basically from Main Street to the northwest. In the background is Spring Street. A little bit to the right would be Temple Street to get your bearings on what would be there in the modern area today. That building is on the left of this photograph. In the center, he built what was called the Market House, roughly a facsimile of Faneuil Hall in Boston, a very famous landmark there. And so the idea was the first floor would have stores. There would be a central hallway, small shops on either side that would be leased out. The upper floor was built as the first true theater in Los Angeles. There had been theatrical performances given in people's houses and other buildings, but this was an actual theater building. The problem was the timing wasn't very good. The economy in 1859, when this was completed, was not in a great state. The gold rush that had made a lot of people money at the end of the American or early American period had basically ended. and we were at the cusp of other changes happening. So this became leased out to the county and city of Los Angeles. The courthouse was on the second floor and city offices on the first level. In fact, things just got worse after that. Even though Temple had a lot of other investments in various places, including San Francisco and Mexico, where he leased the National Mint for quite a number of years, he wound up leaving the area because in the early 1860s there were floods and droughts, smallpox epidemics, locusts, and other problems that happened in this area. So he wound up moving north and died in San Francisco in 1866. He did have a younger half-brother. In fact, they were so far apart in age, 26 years, that they had not met until 1841 when the younger Temple, whose name was Pliny, later known as FPF Temple, came out to California to meet his brother for the first time. This was in the summer of 1841. Pliny was intending just to visit for a short period, but he wound up staying here and was employed by his brother Jonathan in the Los Angeles store. Within several years, Pliny marries a young woman named Antonia Margarita Workman, and we'll get into her background momentarily. When they got married, Pliny had to be baptized Roman Catholic, so he took the baptismal name of Francisco, which is why he was known as FPF Temple, and then immediately got into his wedding ceremony. So this is not a wedding photograph of the couple, it's several years later. But they had the distinction of being the first couple where the marriage ceremony had Anglo surnames in it. There were so few Americans and Europeans in town at that time. Now, Antonia Margarita's father was William Workman, who was from the northern part of England, not too far from the Scottish border. Very remote area. And this is him on the right, pictured with a friend of his named David Alexander. William was enticed to come to the United States by an older brother. And the older brother, David, wound up living in Missouri, which at that time was the end of the United States. We're talking about roughly 1820. And so it was the absolute frontier of the country. To the west, Mexico had just become independent of Spain, or was about to. And so Mexico was encouraging Americans and Europeans to migrate to some of its northern departments or territories, including Texas, New Mexico, and California. The thing in Texas was that so many Americans went out there that as they became the majority, they decided they didn't want to be part of Mexico any longer, and wound up, the Revolution of 1836 happened, and Texas became an independent country for a while. What William did is that as a new trail opened from Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico, called the Santa Fe Trail, he took that in the mid-1820s, wound up settling in Taos, which has an old Indian pueblo to it, but was also a fur trappers colony. So people who were looking for furs in the Rocky Mountains would often spend their winters at Taos. And he saw an opportunity there after trying some fur trapping himself to open a store, which he operated for about 15 years. He also became a Roman Catholic and a Mexican citizen during his years in New Mexico, took the baptismal name of Julian, so he was known as Don Julian to people in New Mexico as well as in California. He had a common law marriage with a woman from Taos named Nicolasa Urioste. We don't have a photograph of her. She was probably indigenous as well as Spanish. The fact that she baptized her daughter, shown here with Mr. Workman, as well as a son, Jose Manuel, in the Indian Pueblo's church, indicates that she had that background. The family, though, left in 1841, partially because of the creation of the Republic of Texas and that country's intention to expand its boundaries all the way to the Rio Grande River, which would have taken the three main towns in New Mexico, because they were all on the eastern side of the river, Santa Fe, Albuquerque, and Taos. And so Workman and his family, the Rowland family that were out there and were very close to the Workmans, other Anglos, as well as a large contingent of New Mexicans, took the Old Spanish Trail, which is a line leading from the center right of this image up to the top left, out to California. That trail went up into central Utah, down through the deserts, including a place called Las Vegas, which was simply a watering hole in the middle of a valley floor, and then down through Cajon Pass and into Los Angeles. They arrived towards the end of 1841, several months after FPF Temple came from Massachusetts to meet his brother. So the Workman and Temple connection dates back to that 1840s era. The Workman family wound up settling on Rancho La Puente, which had been part of the lands of the mission San Gabriel, which is on the left side of this drawing. You can see the mission outlined there, basically, the local roads, and so forth. The land grant to La Puente was made in early 1842 to John Rowland, who also, like Workman, was a Mexican citizen and then entitled to a land grant. And then it was adapted and changed in 1845 into a larger grant tripling roughly the size of the rancho from about 17,000 acres to almost 50,000. The map here is a diseño, or a drawing or rendering of the rancho that you would have as part of your land grant documents. And I'm bringing that up because of a future point I'll make momentarily. The governor in 1845 who made the second land grant was Don Pio Pico, who was born at the San Gabriel Mission and had been the head of the legislature in the Department of Alta California. Pico challenged the existing governor, who was an appointee of Mexico City, about the authority. And so they had a little battle at Cahuenga Pass, not too far from Universal Studios, early in 1845. Workman was the captain of Pico's foreign volunteers, the foreigners meaning the Americans and Europeans. And after Pico became governor, he expanded the land grant to La Puente, kind of as a spoils of war type of thing. But Pico became governor just in time for the American invasion, which took place within about a year and a half of his assuming the role of governor. The war took place in the latter part of 1846, early part of 1847. Workman had a role in that. He was a negotiator between the Californios and the American invading army. When the last battle was fought here in Los Angeles, which was the second conquest of the town by the Americans, the Californios had revolted earlier and taken back their town briefly. Workman brought the flag of truce out as the Americans marched towards town. Almost immediately after the end of the war came the gold rush. In fact, the Mexican Congress ratified the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, ending the war early in 1848. And 9 days prior to that, James Marshall found gold in the Sierra Nevada mountains in Northern California. Totally transformed the area, as you can imagine, but part of that also involved Southern California. The gold was not here, but what was down here were the cattle that would provide the food for a lot of the gold miners and others who were migrating to California. So the rancheros of Southern California were doing quite well because the hide and tallow trade was no longer desired or necessary so much as supplying that fresh meat. And if you can make $25 to $50 per animal when you might be sending hundreds, even thousands up to the gold fields every year, that would be a substantial increase in your income for sure. The Workmans and Temples, in fact, during that gold rush period expanded their land ownership. So the map on the bottom right shows some of the ranchos in the Whittier Narrows area where the San Gabriel River goes in between the Montebello and Puente Hills chains. These ranchos had been granted to various citizens in the 1840s after the missions had basically been shut down, including San Gabriel, which owned all of this land at one time. And so the Workman and Temple families, along with Juan Matias Sanchez, a compadre of theirs, were able to acquire more land during this period, including not too far from Temple City. The gold rush ended basically by the mid-1850s, and that had an effect on people in a variety of ways. The Spanish-speaking Californios in particular were affected because they built their culture and life around the cattle ranch. And so as the demand for cattle was lessening, it became a big problem for them financially. On the left there is a typical image showing what the cattle ranching era might be like, but by the time you get to the 1860s, you start seeing more of the farming. So on the bottom right there is an image of Lake Vineyard, which is now San Marino and Alhambra, orange groves and vineyards, so a reflection of how things were changing. Another problem was that during the American period, federal government required that all owners of land grants from Spain and Mexico go to a commission and then to courts, federal courts, to prove their land grant. That process was an average of 17 years, which could be a very long period of time in terms of maintaining your economic stability. You could die during that period of time. There were the floods and droughts, the end of the gold rush. All of that transpired during that period. So there was a lot of change in land, and a lot of the Spanish-speaking Californios in particular were severely affected by that. After the Civil War, there was a early boom here in Los Angeles, meaning the population almost tripled within a few years. Now that meant from 5,000 to 15,000, so still a relatively small town out here. But Los Angeles really began to grow, to develop a business community. And so the Workmans and Temples decided that, having been ranchers and farmers for quite a long time, they were going to take their money and get involved in business. And there were a variety of projects: oil, real estate, water and mining, and some of that was going to be funded by banking. Workman and Temple had a partner named Isaiah W. Hellman, one of the more prominent early Jewish merchants and financiers of Los Angeles. Hellman was a brilliant business figure, and Temple and Workman probably should have stayed with him and let him manage their affairs. But while they had a bank for about 2.5 years, they divided up, and Hellman went on to great things, including running Wells Fargo, while Temple and Workman tried to go it on their own. The photograph here on the left shows the temple block. So what Jonathan Temple had built in the 1840s and 50s was expanded by his brother F.P.F. Temple in the 1860s and 70s. The three-story building at the center was the last part of that piece, and that is where the Temple and Workman Bank was located. You're looking south, Main Street on the left, Spring Street on the right, Temple Street would cross in the center. Meanwhile, out at the homestead that William Workman established back in the 1840s on Rancho La Puente, he had his house significantly remodeled, the old adobe building still in the center, but he added rooms on the corners and upstairs and dressed it up in architectural styles befitting a banker. And so these are early photos of what he was doing out at the Workman homestead, including his own cemetery that he established called El Campo Santo, and he built a chapel named for his wife, St. Nicholas's, that was again reflective of the wealth that was happening. The Temple family didn't do quite the same thing, but they had their own ways of expressing their changing status in Los Angeles. It looks like they may have been the top two income families in Los Angeles County at their peak. But there's the peak, and then there's the valleys. The Temple and Workman Bank looked on paper and in photograph to be very substantial. The photo shows a beautiful counter with the polished wood and the glass with the fine gold lettering, a substantial vault in the back. But the problem was they were investing depositors' monies in all kinds of different speculative enterprises, whether, again, it's railroads, oil, mining, what have you. And when the economy went south in California in 1875, there was a major crash that year, and there had been a national depression underway already for the last couple of years. They were in some really serious trouble, to the point where when depositors came to close their accounts down, there wasn't enough money in reserve to be able to pay depositors their money. That is not the kind of thing you want to see on your books. So F.P.F. Temple spent a lot of time in San Francisco with his hand out looking for money, and he had a hard time finding anybody who wanted to loan funds during an economic crisis. The only person he could find was a guy named Elias J. Baldwin, known as Lucky Baldwin. Baldwin had made a lot of money in selling out stock in silver mines up in Nevada, and he had been shopping for real estate here in the Los Angeles area, purchasing the Rancho Santa Anita, just to the north of us here, early in 1875, and as he looked around to see what other land was available, he saw that Temple and Workman were the biggest landowners in Los Angeles County, and they were in deep trouble. So the letter on the left from F.P.F. Temple, president of the bank, to his partner and father-in-law, William Workman, is from late November 1875, basically saying, I've obtained money from Baldwin on rather hard terms, as he put it, but it will be all right in the end. The problem was when the $350,000 was placed at the bank, within 6 weeks or so, depositors kept streaming in to close their accounts down, and the money was basically evaporated. The bank closed early in 1876 and went into assignment, which basically was a legal process to deal with what they could with the assets and the liabilities. The problem was that the depositors and those who had credit or had loaned the bank money really got very little out of the whole thing. Baldwin had a blanket mortgage on the Workman and Temple's assets as part of his loan, and so he held all the cards. For William Workman, who was 76 years old, had no involvement in the management of the bank at all, this was a huge shock to him. So on the right, is a note that one of the Temples wrote to Workman's daughter, May 17, 1876, very simply stating, "Grandfather has shot himself this afternoon. Come at once." The suicide of William Workman in his house was a big event in Los Angeles in terms of people realizing just how bad the economic crisis was. This was the first big business failure of any kind in Los Angeles, and a real wake-up call to that first boom. For the Temple family, they receded from the public eye for quite a number of years. The family did retain ownership of the family residences out at La Puente at the Workman homestead, as well as their own homestead in the Whittier Narrows, but they did not have a public presence, and they struggled financially for quite a number of years. Over the course of decades, a lot of things changed. A direct transcontinental railroad connection, another big boom in the 1880s, the bringing in of the Los Angeles aqueduct that allowed a much greater growth, the federal investment and development of the Port of Los Angeles. Many things happened that transformed Los Angeles into a major metropolitan area. For the Temple family, residing out at the Whittier Narrows area, on what had been the Rancho La Merced, Walter P. Temple, who was just a child when the family bank collapsed, was living with his wife, Laura Gonzalez, and their 4 children at a property that they called Temple Heights, and they were farmers, and Walter Temple was an insurance agent and a teamster, but there would be a dramatic change underfoot very quickly, and that will lead us to the next part of our presentations.